You know, being in our new location, one of the things that we want to start because there's a vast necessity for highly qualified teachers. Therefore, we're going to launch JFI's Teachers Academy. And we're going to emphasize on the qualities of a highly qualified teachers. You know, teachers vary in many forms, and they have various skills. But a highly qualified teacher, it varies from person to person. But there are some qualities that keep coming up in the discussion of talking about qualified teachers. Now, why is that important that we begin to focus on that? First of all, we need excellent teachers for child care so that they literally can actually focus on the children receiving the love out of the love of God. Also in preschool, they have the love that's expressed because they really take notice that the teacher that cares is the teacher that they can learn. When they get into elementary school, then they need to find their identity. And in their identity, their love is creative. In other words, they like doing some things. They like interacting with people. So we want to teach teachers how to do it. But it's not just for teachers. We also want to teach parents. We also want to teach grandparents. We want to bring them into the understanding that middle school and high school, they need the same kind of love expression from a teacher. Because it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you are really a teacher because somebody is watching you and somebody is learning from you. But there are some qualities that really need to follow all of us because we should be knowledgeable. In other words, those things that we say should have a continuity to it that people can trust in it. Also, there ought to be a current element of it and enthusiastic. You know, I used to work with children, and one of the things that I found out about children, they receive from people that are enthusiastic because they can see the realness in them. And you have to be touchable and approachable. In other words, if you're not touchable and approachable, they won't come to you when they really want some true answers, and you really do need to be fun. And when I say fun, it don't mean that you need to be childish, but you really need to be in such a way that they can feel that you care enough that you will tell them the truth. And also, once you grow up and you are an adult or a retired person, you should become the wisdom of God. So when we do that, we're talking about highly qualified teachers from a God perspective. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about somebody that's got a relationship with the living God. They have the nature, they have the character, they have the expression at the fruit of in the fruit of the Spirit, so there is no law. But whenever we begin to realize that, you really can't be stable if you don't understand something about biblical understanding. And what we see is there's two fundamental sources of human knowledge. And we really have learned by reason and experience, but now we want to go into a furtherance, and that's by revelation. In other words, in everything we do, and all the people that we teach, children, adults, church, school, they need to know who they are. Because if they don't understand who they are, they'll actually find their identity in who somebody else says they are. They also need to understand where they come from. In other words, they didn't come from a Big Bang theory. They didn't come from evolutionary theory. They really came out of God. And they need to understand where they're going. In other words, what you really understand is they came out of God because there was a purpose for them being in the earth. And we begin to realize it is that thing that they focus on. Why am I here? Who am I? What am I going and where's history taking me? In other words, people need to be grounded now. They need to understand that this thing that God is doing is in a people in the earth. And we understand that there are understandings that the Bible has two forms of revelation. And revelation is from a personal being who created all things. And you know, that reminds me of Paul when he was on Mars Hill. He said, I want to introduce you all on Mars Hill to the God that you ignorantly worship. In other words, people really worship God, and sometimes they don't even have a relationship with God. So they're going through the motion believing that religion has told them how to relate to God one day in the future. But I want you to understand, you need to understand how to worship God even in the now. These usually are called general revelation and special revelation, according to Paul in Psalm 19, verse 1 through 6. And it also depicts it in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. Here it is in Psalm 19. It says, the heaven declares the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. In other words, you can see in the natural thing there had to be a creator that created everything. It's a day upon day utters speech, and night upon night showeth knowledge. So you can see the moon, the stars, and you can understand there is knowledge in the heavens, but God wants to bring it into the earth. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their lines go out throughout all the earth, and the words to the ends of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun. In other words, in time past, they used to read the sun. But now we're actually going into the understanding that a greater revelation is that we have a relationship with the living Son. Verse 5, which is the bridegroom cometh out of the chamber and rejoice as a strong man running in a race. We understand that a true revelation of God is something that everybody needs, not religion, a relationship. He is going forth from the ends of the heavens and has circuits unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. In other words, the sun shines, and there's nothing that hinders it from warming the earth. In Romans chapter 1, in verse 20, it says this. It says, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, understood, being understood by things that are made, even the eternal power of the Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So what it's really saying is that everybody born, because they see the created things, there's no excuse for them not knowing there has to be a God. It goes on to say, but God has revealed truth about his invisible attributes, his eternal power and Godhead, to us through his creation, and the general revelation is available to all. In addition to the eternal revelation of nature, he has also implanted the knowledge of his existence in every human heart. So that's what I want to do in teaching and instructing, is activate that God ingredient that God has put in every man's house. Although many choose to suppress this truth unrighteousness. So what you have to realize is that you can reject it, you can suppress it, you can literally reject God. But here's what it says in Hebrews, which is a better covenant. And we'll get into that as we go. But a better covenant. In other words, Hebrews 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets. Notice
that was in past. Verse 2, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. So Jesus, by the wisdom of God, actually was in God, creating the world. Because we see that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So you have to realize that the God of the Bible is both the Creator and the Redeemer. So the one that created the heavens and the earth also redeemed you back to himself. And the cross portrayed the central theme of history. In the Old Testament, it anticipates the work of the Messiah in many ways. In the New Testament, it points back to Jesus as the author and the perfecter of our faith. So we realize that God is doing something now, but even in this time, he really says, now I want you to understand something. In Hebrews chapter 12 and 2, it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God, and he is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. So you see that also in the scriptures as they're fulfilled. It says, indeed, Christ claims to be the key to the scriptures, and one of whom the entire Old Testament spoke. And we see that in Luke 22, 44 through 47. We're going to read that. And he said unto them, these are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled. He was speaking of himself, which were written in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and the Psalms, really concerning him. So what he was really saying is that he is going to be fulfillment of the Old Testament, of the law of Moses, and the prophets, and the Psalm, and it's going to be summed up in the first begotten Son. It goes on to say in 46, and said unto them, thus is written, thus behooved Christ to suffer, and to be risen from the dead on the third day, that the repentance and remission of sin should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. So in understanding that, we understand that the scriptures are actually going to say, when Jesus hung on the cross, he really said, it is finished. The scriptures are completely divine. They're completely human, meaning inspired of God, written through man. There is a parallel here of God, man, Jesus Christ through the man. There is an expression that the Bible declares, and we're going to bring it to a close and pick it up later. Paul added that all scriptures are God-breathed, that is, inspired by God. One of the evidences are of divine origin. The Bible itself is unique. And it's unique in three different ways. One, it is unique in its production. Two, it is unique in its preservation. Three, it is unique in its proclamation and its uniqueness, and it's unique in its production. As a revelation of God's love, the Bible requires a response. And we're saying that as we declare this new thing to you, and as we express, we're going to equip teachers that's going to be able to function in this world from another world and be able to function and teach in two different worlds. I say to you, welcome to the greatest expressive academy of teachers in the whole world. Welcome to justice. Let's do it.